From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will cover the latest grain market developments. He'll refer to a new index that the CME maintains that tracks the level of price volatility in the wheat, corn, and soybean markets, and he compares the current volatility to that of historical trends. Then K-State's Sarah Lancaster returns, this time to discuss the outbreak of volunteer corn turning up in soybean stands around the state right now. She'll talk about the complications that causes for beans and what herbicide control options are available to you growers. And later on, we'll welcome back in K-State's Mary Knapp to talk Kansas agricultural weather. Plus more for you right here on Agriculture Today. Thanks for listening in. You're tuned to the K-State Radio Network, and this is Agriculture Today. Well, the grain markets these days are hardly for the faint of heart. Let's put it that way. As we review this past week's trends, which were excitable to say the least, and talk about some of the other market factors in play, Dan O'Brien is here once more. He's a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. What to pick from here, Dan? Well, first of all, the markets are clearly casting their best lots as to the productivity of our summer crops with this current weather pattern in place.
Yes, I think that the dry conditions in the northern Corn Belt, north central states, particularly in North Dakota, South Dakota, good chunk of Minnesota, and also depending on whether you look at the complete picture of subsoil and rainfall or just rainfall, all but the southeastern portion of Iowa, and also as dry, the northern, probably 35-40% of Illinois. There's a lot of dramatic dryness that's affecting crop output prospects this year. And you know, the strength that we see, even with the ups and downs and what's becoming almost commonplace 20, 30, 40-cent swings at these high price levels, we're still, again, given the situation we're in, we're still seeing September corn close yesterday at $5.64, Dees corn at $5.61, August beans $14.16, November $13.62, September hard red winter wheat $6.53 and a quarter. Heading out to the end of the year, Dees at $6.64 and 3/4. So, again, strong markets. And I think the question that we've been thinking on has to do with, well, what do we normally see in terms of volatility and seasonal trends from here? And do they hold this year? I think that's the way I'd couch that.
And as a matter of fact, you say that the CME has come out with an interesting new tool, a volatility index, which addresses that very thing from a historical perspective.
Yes. For corn, for soybeans, really for a broad swath of the futures contracts they trade, they have what they call the CVOL index, CVOL. Without a lot of trouble finding it, you can do a search CME, CVOL indices and find this thing free of charge to look at. Unless you want to buy the deep historic data, then they'll charge you. But the seasonal trends, I guess in putting what we've seen recently in volatility and the seasonal trends in prices, for corn cash prices in Kansas, we tend to see the high for the year in June, moving somewhat lower into July and then falling off more so into August. And same pattern and maybe a little less of a fall off, just slightly less perhaps, for grain sorghum. For wheat, we basically have a pretty sideways trend that happens. But again, that even during harvest, for wheat, we'll tend to see June, July be the lower years, but then pretty much sideways, a slight decline, slight ups. For soybeans, seasonal trend for that tends to run up from June, and again, the high in July, and then moving lower into August. So that's what's tended to happen over time in our Kansas crops. Now, for this current marketing year that we're in, ending August 31st, and you look at the futures prices and what they're saying and apply basis assumptions to them, carrying current basis levels forward, what we've seen from June into July, pretty strong decline for soybeans, projection, if you follow that trend, even more so, down into August, and we've seen a sharp drop-off for corn from June into July, and if anything, futures showing just a little bit of an uptick. We'll talk about those factors later. And really pretty much an identical situation for grain sorghum. And then when you look into the next marketing year, what's surprising, after all the seasonality, surprising to me, after all the seasonality being reflected, actually having happened this year, when you look at into futures-based projections for next year, they're flat, which means to me that the trade has its eyes on D's corn for grain sorghum and corn cash prices. For soybeans, they're watching November new crop contract. They're tending to watch, since we're into the next marketing year, new crop marketing year for wheat, they're watching the lead contract. Again, for wheat, things tend to go sideways. So I guess there's not a lot of information there to give us any aspect of seasonality to expect once we get to harvest and thereafter, because they're all the futures are, with basis assumptions, they're all projecting sideways. So not a lot of help in terms of marketing strategies. I would say, as you mentioned, volatility, that along with that cash price trend that tends to move lower for corn, it's interesting, back in 2019, we had highest volatility during May heading into July, and then from about where we're at now, we fell off into fall harvest. And why is that? Well, we have all these questions about just how much crop loss we might have. We're dealing with exceedingly dry conditions here in the U.S., in some areas. Well, here we got the crop in. We still have risk, but now the risk is more along the lines probably of if we gain or lose 250 to 500 million bushels, whereas the questions we were dealing with back in May, June, is it 1 or 2 billion bushels or just what? So as that uncertainty tends to resolve itself, even with all the challenges in the northern states that we still have, we've got a better idea through a lot of the Corn Belt of where we're at, and uncertainty tends to fall off.
But that volatility in corn prices currently is similar to that of 2019. So we're not in uncharted waters.
We're not in uncharted waters. What we just went through was probably 15, 20% higher volatility as you look at these measures in May, June, early July of 2021 than we had back in 2019. 2020, we also saw a fall off, but again, not near as many big questions. So saw during July down into from the beginning to the end of the month, quite a fair amount of fall off. I would say when you look at soybeans, again, we're kind of looking at feed grains and soybeans at the same mode. Very similar pattern, but in 2019 is more of a glide lower in terms of volatility. But even though we moved lower with volatility measures, the prices were sideways a little bit higher. It's just that we weren't jumping around so much. And with what we've seen in this year for soybeans, again, almost double the volatility in 2020 than we had in 2019. But even with that, we come off the highs we've seen in the soybean market and are moving lower. I want to just mention that we've been talking about focusing on our own U.S. domestic issues. Well, there's freeze damage that's affected the late-planted corn crop in Brazil. And dry conditions down there have affected river flows in Argentina. So that affects their ability to produce corn for Argentina, their ability to ship soybeans, soybean meal. So you have issues there. And the biggest issue that we here in Kansas are affected by that's not happening here would be all the dry conditions in the Dakotas, and especially up into Canada, that's affecting hard red spring wheat production.
Dramatically so.
So we've come through harvest, and we're seeing hard red winter wheat prices at $650, $660, $670. And not a lot of fall off in that. So part of that is wheat feeding, we think we're seeing, but a chunk of it has to do with the problems on our own continent in North America with regard to wheat production. That, and again, one day I see a great report out of the Black Sea region. The next day I see a terrible report. I don't know which one to follow, but it does seem that there's at least some reverberating uncertainty over there. And I did see a report that just came out, Vladimir Putin in Russia is taking steps to control food inflation. So we can say anything we want, but when you have food inflation going on, you got tight supplies and something's afoot in terms of bread and other basic food products.
Broadly speaking, though, Dan, there's this fundamental underpinning supporting all of these markets, and that's not eroding at all, it doesn't seem.
We have an accumulation of events in crop production areas that have lended towards scarcity. Mm-hmm. And throw one more in, rains again emerged in some significant crop production areas in China. Again, it's about the second or third year in a row. So it's just an interesting year to be watching the various factors that are coming at you. You know, it's almost as if I can remember years when we thought, well, boy, the rains will come, we'll have good crops, and we couldn't anticipate when we'd ever see another dry situation. Well, we've got hot spots literally all over the globe. Hot spots are too wet, and that's leading to tightness of supply-demand balances. So maybe the last thing I say, Eric, is if we have these tougher conditions showing up around the world, where does that put us come harvest? And what type of situations might we be looking at? Generally, in a tighter deal like this, you tend to see prices not stay low, but they tend to be higher at harvest, and marketing opportunities tend to come at that time. And then that, of course, sets off more acreage intentions in all these countries to plant. And eventually, and when we came into that 2012, 2013, that drought the following year, we came back with stronger crops. Eventually, after the first 6 or so months, the markets came back down because we had good crops coming on. So if you're anticipating anything, it would be that we might see a situation like that heading out of 2021 into 2022.
Well, in any event, picking the right marketing opportunity on the part of our producers is adventurous, if nothing else. But all is relatively well, you'd have to say. And Dan, we appreciate the comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. We'll be back on this Agriculture Today. We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and welcoming back in weed management specialist Sarah Lancaster of K-State Research and Extension. She's quite busy this time of the year as all sorts of weed control issues are brought to her attention by producers, by county agents, and others. And we will tackle, Sarah, one of those today. You're getting the word from quite a few quarters out there about volunteer corn turning up in growing soybean crops. To what extent?
Eric, it is a very common sight, at least for me driving here around kind of northeast Kansas, to see volunteer corn poking through soybean canopies. And I understand that from others that have been in other parts of this state that it's a problem that's more widespread as well.
Before we talk about what this means in terms of competitiveness with soybeans, any thoughts as to why we're seeing this somewhat excessive volunteer corn turn up?
So, there's a couple of things that come into play in this conversation. One is the fact that we are looking at corn hybrids that are Roundup Ready Liberty Link and soybean varieties that are Roundup Ready Liberty Link. And our go-to products in our soybean these days are 2,4-D or dicamba, which are not effective on corn. So it requires an extra herbicide in order to control that volunteer corn in your soybeans. The other factor could be harvest conditions. I obviously am not an agricultural engineer nor an expert at setting combines, but sometimes there are conditions associated with harvest that make the amount of corn left in the field in the fall a little greater than others. And so that can be a contributor as well. Something else I've observed based on the patterns in the field, Eric, is just cleaning out planting equipment when you switch from corn to soybeans. I've seen a few fields that look like maybe there was some corn left in the planter boxes when the switch was made to that particular soybean field. So, it can wind up there through a variety of mechanisms, but the point is that it can be a real problem for producers.
Which we'll get into. These outbreaks tend to be somewhat localized and sporadic within a field as opposed to widespread.
So, it depends on the cause. If it's a harvest thing, obviously, you're going to see the population line up with where the residue, the chaff was coming out the back of the combine. If it's a planter issue, a planter clean out issue, it is pretty localized. And you'll see, it's right down the row. It's pretty pretty clear how it got there in some situations.
To the point at hand here, how much of an issue is volunteer corn in soybeans in as far as, again, competing for resources and hindering that soybean crop?
Yeah, so, you've got a crop and a crop, basically. So both are designed to try to be as competitive as possible. The most geographically relevant and recent research I found on the data comes from actually South Dakota. And they looked at different densities of volunteer corn in soybeans, and yield losses ranged from right around 10% at low densities to as much as over 70% at greater densities. And so obviously this could present a problem for growers come harvest when they're trying to, not only the yield loss, but also the difficulties of harvesting if you do have a heavy infestation of volunteer corn.
So one has volunteer corn going out there in their beans. As far as how they respond to it, that will have to relate to the density of that infestation with respect to investing in a control approach, right?
Right. So the chemical recommendation or the herbicide recommendation for this, Eric, is generally a group 1 herbicide. So something like Select Max, Assure 2, Fusilade, Post. There are a lot of different options in that regard. And so adding those in with your post-emergent application of, glyphosate plus Liberty or 2,4-D or dicamba or whatever you're putting in the tank there is a good practice. If you've got volunteer corn in your field, the recommendation then would be to put one of these group 1 herbicides in as part of your tank mix. The caveat to this recommendation, though, Eric, is that the group 4 herbicides, so 2,4-D and dicamba, are pretty antagonistic to the group 1 herbicides, the Selects and the Assures, and things of that nature. So it's important when you put that in your tank mix, especially if you have volunteer corn of any size, that you go ahead and increase the rate of your grass herbicide to make sure that you get good control of that corn and overcome that potential antagonism in the spray tank.
Does one want to think about the method of application, particularly here, Sarah? An over-the-top treatment's okay, or would a wick treatment, if corn has emerged and is taller than the soybean crop itself?
A wick application would be an option there if you want to use less product and go with a more specific and targeted application. Wick applications are dependent on getting good coverage, good contact with that weed, and having that height differential, which much of the corn that we're seeing in these soybean fields now is significantly taller than the soybean. The other factor you have to consider, I think, at this point in the growing season, Eric, is the fact that the soybeans are starting to canopy in a lot of these fields. And so there is going to be a potential yield hit running through the fields at this stage in the game. So, really, from my perspective, the best way to handle it is with that last post-emergence application that you're planning to put one of those group 1 herbicides into the spray tank.
With any of the options you discussed there, as far as injury to the soybean crop itself, even applied over the top, very minimal concern about that, Sarah?
Group 1 herbicides like Select and Assure are safe on soybeans. The one thing we need to think about as far as a crop response there to the herbicide application is that sometimes for best results, we need to apply these herbicides with a crop oil or with a surfactant and some nitrogen potentially. And so you do see some crop response there when you add those adjuvants into the spray tank, especially if you're applying on hot, humid days.
All right. Main thing, though, if producers have volunteer corn out there, they probably need to get on that problem as soon as feasible.
Absolutely. Like any weeds, the earlier we attack it, the better we're going to be in terms of control. So the smaller the weed is, the easier it is to manage.
So once again, producers, check your fields, see if volunteer corn is coming on strongly enough to merit a herbicide response. If it is, Sarah has outlined some alternatives for you to consider here. Before we let you go, Sarah, other weed control matters of interest for our soybean growers right now?
So the one thing that we've kind of been working through in terms of wrapping up applications in our research plots, and that I've noticed also driving around, a lot of producers, I think, are planning to go with Liberty as their post-emergent herbicide option this year. And I just wanted to remind folks that there's a R1, so beginning flowering cutoff for using Liberty in soybeans. So, we mentioned the importance of timeliness for those volunteer corn applications. So if you intend to do it with your post-emergent herbicide application, it's probably right around the corner, or maybe even past in a lot of cases.
Falls under the heading of keep an eye on that product label, doesn't it?
Eric, most of our conversations involve either check the label or put boots in the field. So
applicable in this case as well. And to add to that, be sure to refer to the 2021 Chemical Weed Control Guide from K-State for comprehensive information on all weed control options for all of our major field crops, including, in our case today, soybeans. Sarah, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
She's a weed management specialist with K-State Research and Extension. That's Sarah Lancaster, again, with approaches to controlling volunteer corn and soybeans. And speaking of bean production, taking us up to the break, quick details on a pair of field days that K-State's Department of Agronomy will be sponsoring in the weeks ahead, both of which have a distinct soybean theme to them. The Kansas River Valley Experiment Field will host its field day on Tuesday, August the 10th at 5 o'clock in the evening. That's just 1 mile east of Rossville along U.S. Highway 24. There will be full research updates involving strategies to manage weeds in soybeans, also a glance at managing soybeans to increase yield and quality, and more. There will be a sponsored catered barbecue meal. As part of this field day, you need to call the Shawnee County Extension Office to reserve your spot at it, 785-232-0062. That's the 2021 Fall Field Day at the Kansas River Valley Experiment Field, just outside of Rossville. And then K-State's East Central Kansas Experiment Field will host its Field Day on Wednesday, August the 18th. This is a morning event at the field just south of Ottawa on U.S. Highway 59, then a mile east. Sarah Lancaster and others will be on board to discuss integrated weed management in current herbicide-resistant soybean systems, plus a look at managing soybeans to increase yield and quality, plus more to that program. Again, that's at K-State's East Central Kansas Experiment Field just south of Ottawa, the field day Wednesday, August the 18th. Get either or both of those field days on your calendars, producers. We'll be back after these moments away. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and checking now on today's agricultural news headlines in brief for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, as the U.S. Senate continues to ponder that massive infrastructure bill, Republicans this week launched a series of statements on the spending and tax proposals, arguing that they would put family farms and ranches at risk. The entire GOP Senate caucus criticized the plans to raise capital gains taxes and eliminate stepped-up bases for inherited assets, saying they would be devastating to farmers, ranchers, and other family businesses. Democrats have maintained their proposals would not raise taxes on the vast majority of Americans, but would raise taxes on the wealthy. Now, Senator John Boozman of Arkansas, the ranking member of the Senate, cited a statement made early on by USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack, who said that 98% of farms would not be affected by the plans to increase taxes on those making more than $400,000 per year. Vilsack also has said that farmers and family-owned businesses would not be affected by the proposed increases in capital gains or elimination of stepped-up bases as long as heirs continue to operate the farm or ranch. The tax hikes would affect families who end up selling the farm or ranch, he said. Boozman noted that he and other Republican senators had asked the secretary to provide evidence to support those claims. He said they asked the USDA to show its math, in Boozman's words, and adding that request, he said, had gone unanswered. The latest known details on the president's tax plan for reconciliation is that it would tax unrealized capital gains at death at 43.4%. That would be up from 23.8% after including the Medicare surtax. The plan would exempt $1 million in assets for an individual, $2 million per couple. That would effectively repeal the stepped-up basis carryover that heirs receive from estates. The USDA early in this process stated that the tax would not be imposed for people who inherit farms as long as those farms remained in the family operation. At least some rural Democrats have pushed for a full exemption for farms and ranches to be written into law. The plan would also increase income taxes for people making over $400,000 in taxable income annually, up from 37% to 39.6%. Milk production nationally continues to grow as the dairy herd expands. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Milk production may not be growing as much as some had expected, but the latest USDA milk production report shows that during the April through June quarter, U.S. milk output was still 3.7% higher than the same spring quarter last year at just over 58 billion pounds. This was produced by a herd averaging just over 9.5 million head, about 141,000 more than the same spring quarter last year. We have milk per cow numbers for June now coming in at about 27 pounds more than June a year ago. Coming to us shortly, USDA will have its twice-yearly cattle inventory report. That'll give us an even better idea of the dairy inventory and will include producer intentions as far as how many heifers they intend to retain for dairy cow replacement. Earlier this month, USDA's Outlook Board projected the average all-milk price next year would increase by about 1%, despite a possible production increase of about 1.5%. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And narrowing that down to the Kansas numbers, milk production in this state during June of 2021 totaled 344 million pounds. That was up 7% from June of last year, according to the National Agricultural Statistics Service. The average number of milk cows, 175,000 head, 7,000 head more than June of last year in Kansas. Milk production per cow averaging 1,965 pounds. A well-rounded informational event for you producers is set to take place in south-central Kansas in mid-October. Kansas Wheat is serving as one of the co-sponsors of Farmer U, and it'll highlight current wheat research initiatives in Kansas. Marcia Boswell offers this preview on the Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
Ready for the return of in-person agricultural events? Mark your calendar for August 18th and 19th. For a new event organized by the High Plains Journal, Farmer U. The event will take place in Mulvane, Kansas, at the Kansas Star Event Center, and will include speakers, educational breakout sessions, panel discussions, and a trade show. According to Justin Gilpin, CEO of Kansas Wheat, we are looking forward to gathering together again to learn from agricultural experts and fellow farmers who are at the top of their fields. We hope you will join us in Mulvane as we work together to continue the innovations of Kansas agriculture. Michelle Miller, also known as the Farm Babe on social media, will open the event by discussing how farmers and ranchers can counter the misinformation spread about agriculture and work to educate consumers. Rob Sharkey, also known as the Shark Farmer, will close the event. Sharkey is a fifth-generation farmer from Illinois who hosts a podcast titled Shark Farmer Podcast, a radio show on Sirius XM, and a television show on RFD TV called Shark Farmer TV. He will focus on his unconventional journey to becoming a disruptor in the agriculture industry and how his media ventures center around providing a platform for stories about people in agriculture. The event will also include 2 panel discussions, a farmer panel and a women's panel. Educational breakout sessions will cover soil health, irrigation, soybeans, wheat, sorghum, alfalfa, and corn. The Farmer U and Trade Show event will also include the Farmer U Awards, including the 2021 Woman of the Year Award and 2021 Farmer of the Year Awards, given in the categories of alfalfa, corn, cotton, soil health, sorghum, soybeans, and wheat. To learn more about the speakers, trade show, or to register, visit www.farmeru.net. Join Kansas Wheat at booth number 164 to learn more about the Kansas Association of Wheat Growers August membership promotion and discount, as well as Wheat RX, a partnership between Kansas Wheat and K-State Research and Extension to disseminate the latest research recommendations for high-yielding and high-quality wheat to Kansas wheat farmers. Pre-registration is $100 per person, and on-site registration is $125 per person. High Plains Journal subscribers receive a $25 discount at pre-registration and on-site registration pricing. Check your current High Plains Journal issue for the discount code. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
All right, Marcia, many thanks. Well, by all appearances, we're about to embark on a multi-day run of hot and mostly dry weather in Kansas. K-State's Mary Knapp awaits to fill in the details during this week's Kansas Agricultural Weather segment. That's next here on Agriculture Today. We're back now on Agriculture Today, and to close out this edition, it's to Kansas agricultural weather and the latest report from K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. The heat, Mary, is back, and it's to stay for a spell. We'll get into that, but let's quickly recount what's happened this past week.
Right. Remember that our week ends on Tuesday. So last week, which went from the 14th of July through the 20th, we saw some abundant rains in parts of the state, mostly confined to the central and eastern parts of the state, although the southwest saw its own share of the rainfall. They averaged 71/100ths of an inch, which is just over 115% of what they normally would get. On the other side of the state, southeast Kansas had more than they wanted. They averaged 3.34 inches, which is 371% of normal for an area that's normally wet. So undoubtedly that created problems with flooding and other complications with that. The northwest and west central areas of the state were those that missed out on it. They averaged 0.3 of an inch in both of those divisions, which is just 37% of normal.
So all of that was captured in the latest drought monitor, one assumes.
Yes, it was. And what we saw from the drought monitor weren't very major changes, but there was a slight expansion in the abnormally dry conditions in northwest Kansas, as might be expected with that lack of rain. And there was some trimming of the drought on the edges of that band in the central part of the state. And again, a fairly large reduction of abnormally dry in the southeast where things have been very, very wet. But unfortunately, as we look forward, it's not going to be as promising to continue that improvement.
Which we'll detail shortly here. Cooler than normal last week, you say, and that was just what the corn crop ordered.
Right. At this point, we have almost 90% of the corn at completed tasseling and flowering, which, again, they benefited greatly from those cooler temperatures while they were going through that critical development phase. Not so much benefit to the sorghum and soybean crops, particularly the sorghum crops, as we're falling behind on the growing degree accumulation. We'll make up for that in the next week or so.
Well, let's get right to that. Heat is returning, and it's a matter of the intensity of that coming hot weather.
Right. As we go into the next week, 10 days, and even in the 8 to 14-day outlook, there is a bullseye of good chances of warmer than normal temperatures across the central plains, including Kansas. At this point, they're not really indicating how much above normal, but as we go into next week, we're looking at highs in the eastern part of the state in the upper 90s to low 100s and likely similar temperatures to our west. that is warmer than we would normally see, but isn't the searing heat that the western areas of the country have endured so far this summer.
But accompanying the heat will be humidity.
Right, and that will be a big difference from what we saw when we had our heat wave in middle June. At that time, the humidity levels were very low, even in the eastern parts of the state. So we had a lot of heat index values that were actually cooler than the air temperature. That's not likely to be the case as we go into this weekend and into next week. We're looking at dew point temperatures that'll be in the upper 60s to low 70s, and those dew points are an indication of just how cool the nighttime temperatures will get. And when we keep those nighttime temperatures elevated like this, it's detrimental to the crops, it's detrimental to the livestock, and it's not very good for people either.
And speaking of that stress on livestock, to remind you of the Animal Comfort Index at the Mesonet website. It'll come back into popularity, unfortunately, here pretty quickly.
Right. And what's nice about that Cattle Comfort Index is it does have a graphing feature where you can trace how it's been going over the last 7 days. Because as we know, it's not just that night to night that's an issue. It's how long has this stress been on the livestock. We also have a feature that's more geared toward the human side of things. It's the heat index, and that is available on our website as well. If you go under the weather, there is a tab that will take you to the heat index values. If you're interested in why we're having the heat that we're having, the Agronomy E-Update has an article that talks about what we might expect and why those conditions are likely to develop. There's also a little brief at the end of things to keep in mind as you're looking to adjust to those temperatures that we're expecting.
It's all at mesonet.ksu.edu, and the Agronomy E-Update article she mentions at agronomy.ksu.edu. Briefly, there is, Mary, a weak system expected to push through from Nebraska into Kansas over the weekend. Will it carry much of a chance of any precipitation at all?
At this time, it's not expected to be very productive, and we are also getting some smoke, haze, and high-level clouds from the fires to our west that are shading conditions a little bit and keeping a lid on the temperature to a degree. So we are likely to have enough instability that some storms may develop, but they're likely to be very localized and not very productive as far as how much moisture is squeezed out of it. If we look at the quantitative precip forecast for the week ending next Friday, the western two-thirds of the state is expected to get nothing, 0, and the eastern areas are likely to only see as much as maybe a quarter of an inch, which when we normally would get close to an inch for the week is going to be well under what we would typically expect.
Well, folks, buckle up for the next several days. It's going to be true summer weather here in Kansas. Mary, a good weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. You as well.
Mary Knapp, over from the Weather Data Library here at K-State, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. And the best to you this weekend. Likewise, please be back with us here on Monday. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.